in terms of formal processes, but this is more just what can we learn from each other, and can't think of a better person to learn from than Sandy. So Sandy, I'll let you take it away, and we'll open up the discussion afterwards.
Sounds great. Thanks, Mary. Really appreciate being with this group. I didn't realize, or I had forgotten that I was the first speaker. So that's pretty awesome. I think we were also one of the first to pilot the IIRC framework when it was being developed so many years ago. So really appreciate the opportunity to come back and kind of share a little bit about what our journey has been. Let's see if I can, there we go. So for those of you who may not be familiar with who AEP is, American Electric Power, we're one of the largest electric utilities in the United States. And historically, we've been known, our legacy is coal-fired generation. The last decade, we've been on a major transformation. We've already retired about 13,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation. By the end of 2028, we'll retire another 5,300 megawatts. And as you can well imagine, that is a massive transformation for any company or any industry. We are projecting to be over 50% of our generating portfolio to be clean by 2032. And that used to be in the single-digit percentage so many years ago. So it is a massive transition that's underway. We've also been setting carbon reduction goals since the early 2000s. And in the last 3 or 4 years, we actually published 2 different climate reports. Our last one in 2021 was the TCFD report. We set goals for 80% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And just last fall, accelerated that net zero goal to 2045. And the reason is because when we do our integrated resource planning for our regulated utilities, more and more we're seeing renewables come up as the most cost-effective option for meeting customers' energy needs. So we've got a lot of renewables in the queue for the next couple of years, so you'll see a lot of activity there. You know, a lot of social issues that have been really, really important to us: diversity, equity, and inclusion, energy equity. One of the things I've been leading in the last couple of years is environmental and social justice. We put a policy in place. We're now building a framework to operationalize that across the enterprise. And we've also put in a human rights policy. These are some of the things that I could have ever imagined when I joined the company in 2006. You know, we have 7 regulated operating companies, 5.6 million customers. It's a big company and about 17,000 employees. So that's a little bit about who we are as a company. This is a little bit about what our journey has looked like. And when I was going through this, I put this together a couple of years ago, and I'm just always amazed at what we've been able to accomplish. What really got us started down this path was a shareholder proposal, as you know, usually is the catalyst for change. A shareholder proposal that had been brought forward seeking transparency on AEP's emissions. We weren't reporting what our emissions were. And forget carbon, it was just everything else. And the board agreed to establish a board level committee to issue this report back in 2003. That was before I got here. So fast forward to 2006. And one of the commitments was we're going to be transparent about our emissions, but that had not been occurring. And so that gave me an opportunity to make the pitch for a sustainability report. That was one piece of it. The other piece was that, you know, stakeholders had no idea where we stood on issues. They also had a lot of misperceptions about who we were as a company. There were concerns internally from employees on an aging workforce at the time, and the lack of knowledge of how the company was handling those things. So I made the pitch, issued our first sustainability report in 2007. We followed the GRI framework. That was interesting. That was my first introduction to GRI. We also put in place a formal stakeholder engagement process, which I would say today is very mature mature and has really evolved. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But as you can see, there's a lot of firsts there. Our first integrated report actually was 3 years after we got started, 3 or 4 years after we got started in 2010. And that's when we piloted the IIRC framework. And when I go back and I look at that particular sustainability report, we were using the little icons as well from the framework so that we could make those connections visually. Through the years, materiality has become really important, as it is for pretty much every company. We did our first one in 2012. We're currently in the process of doing a double materiality assessment, or we're attempting to do that. We put some governance in place through the years. We have an Enterprise Sustainability Council, which has more than 30 people from business units across the company. We have a corporate ESG committee that meets on a monthly basis now. And the other thing too is the ESG data center. That's got over 250 data points. And that's an online data center, if you will, that investors absolutely love. So a lot of things going on through the years, really proud of what we've accomplished. And when I look at this, it's like, oh my gosh, we've come a really long way. So to give you a little bit of a snapshot of, where we were and where we've come, when I first got to AEP, what sustainability and why should I care about this? It was so new to not just, I think in general, but especially to the electric utility industry. People just had no idea what it was. I was still learning it at the time. And there, the landscape around us was very different. I remember I came from the Northeast where energy efficiency, for example, is kind of in your DNA. It wasn't the case in the Midwest. And so I would ask, well, where are energy efficiency programs and why don't we have more of that? And people would look at me like I had like two heads. Because coal is cheap, we got lots of it. Why would we want people to not use our product? And those are the kinds of things that I was hearing at that time. Most of our focus was on compliance, environmental compliance with the Clean Air Act in particular. We were putting environmental controls on our coal plants. That was a big thing at that time. We had very little to no focus on our supply chain. We had no insights into that whatsoever. We hadn't really gotten into stakeholder engagement unless we were forced to. So we never really actually convened stakeholder meetings and sat across the table from groups like Sierra Club and NRDC. And we were also seeing shareholder activism on the rise, and nobody really knew what to do with that because a lot of it was climate, it was emissions, it was political engagement. And so all of those things started showing up on my desk. And I had to figure out what to do with all of that. So, fast forward to where we are today, and, sustainability and ESG really is part of our business strategy. And our reporting, as I'm sure it is with all of you, is integrated. It continues to be integrated. I always felt like that was super important to show the connections between the financial and the non-financial. And so we've continued to do that through the years, but it's also more targeted. And it's more complex because the demands from different stakeholders continue to evolve. And so we have to change with it and meet those needs because, as you know, we are being rated and ranked, and those things are impacting our ability to access capital, the cost of capital, our credit ratings, our insurability of assets, all the different things that all these different surveys and ratings and rankings. And all the disclosure really, really impacts every part of our business. I talked a little bit about the environmental and social justice and human rights. It took me 10 years to get a supplier code of conduct in place. And I tell that story all the time because for me, what it says is have patience in this business and persevere. You will persevere. And what I learned in that is that the organization wasn't ready and I needed to get them ready. I wouldn't want everything to take 10 years, that's for sure. But eventually we got there, and now we've got a sustainable procurement team, which is very exciting. But it's been a lot of work, through the years just to get there. And, one of the measures of success for me is that we have 0 shareholder proposals that make it to the proxy statement every year. That's an important measurement for me. And we are 6+ years running, and we've had 0 shareholder proposals that go to the proxy. Now, that doesn't mean that there were not either something filed and withdrawn or something that was threatened. In fact, I had to negotiate 2 threats of shareholder proposals this past year in the fall. And what does it mean? It means more disclosure lots of times, or agreeing to do something. For example, one of the things we agreed to do was a report on our trade association climate lobbying alignment with our own position on climate change. So we're working to get that out before the annual meeting of shareholders in April. And the other one was around DEI metrics. Investors were telling us that we need, in order to understand the maturity level of your DEI program, we need to see certain metrics. It's not just board diversity, and it's not just workforce diversity, but it's hiring, advancement, retention. You can hire lots of diverse candidates, but if you are unable to retain them and advance them through the ranks, then you're really not, your program really isn't going where investors want to see it go. So those were a couple things. And so when we release our sustainability report in May, we'll have some new DEI metrics. And it also caused us to take a look at how we present that data in the first place. So there'll be some streamlining of that. You're probably all familiar with the anti-ESG movement that's going on. I would say that it's really interesting. And, I say, yeah, it makes every day fun for AEP because we are in red states. Nearly every state that we are in is deep red, and our investors are deep blue. And so there's always this tension between different stakeholders. So, when we're in a state of Texas, for example, we're not talking about ESG. We're maybe not talking about sustainability. What we're talking about is clean, affordable, reliable energy that helps to keep rates stable for customers. And we're talking about our clean energy transition. We're just not using that terminology. Whereas with investors, it's a totally different story. They just want to talk ESG. It's really important to them. So, I had a conversation with our senior vice president in our Washington, D.C. office recently and asked her, where she thinks this is going, particularly with Ron DeSantis taking up the mantle at the federal level, as governor of Florida, but also running for president. And she doesn't think it's going to get much traction at the federal level, but it is getting traction in the states. And so we're trying to stay out of that, but it does make for interesting conversations with some of our states. In fact, we did a pilot program for just transition with a coal plant in East Texas that retires at the end of this month, actually. That plant, and it was a successful, very good experience. The employees, nearly 60 of the employees all found jobs within AEP. Some of them went to work at one of our large wind farms, but the state wants to keep that coal plant open, and so they're fighting tooth and nail right to the very last day. So it's disheartening, but it is what it is. And we just monitor it and try to stay out of that conversation. The unfortunate part of that is that it is really costing consumers, who are our customers, in the sense of it's costing their states more to borrow money. It's also, if they're public employees, like let's say they work for police, fire, education, it's hurting their retirement funds, their pension funds. So we're starting to see some states push back because of that very reason. So that makes for a very interesting situation. It's not something I would have ever guessed would be on the radar, but here we are, and it's not going away anytime soon. this is, I am sure you are all very, very familiar with this, and this is what it looks like for us and all the different standards, frameworks, ratings, rankings, all of that. Our corporate sustainability report is the fundamental piece of information. That's our storytelling, right? Putting all the data into context, but it's fundamental to being able to respond to all of these different frameworks, standards, and surveys. And that's also where the ESG data center comes into play. So how did we get to that data center? About almost 5 years ago now, we said, we're constantly getting asked for these specific data points. Let's look at all of the surveys that we get asked to complete. Let's look at all of the metrics that are the most relevant for AEP, that we are most frequently asked for, and let's just put them out there. So when we do our data collection at the beginning of the year for the sustainability report, we're also collecting for the data center, which then feeds into all, between the sustainability report and the data center, all of that feeds into all of these and helps to populate all of these different these frameworks and et cetera. So it's quite the ecosystem that we have to deal with. And I don't think it's going to get any better, even though the SEC is going to mandate climate disclosure in financial filings. Cyber's already moved over to financial filings, and human capital management is not far behind. But I don't think your sustainability report is going anywhere, because that is where the storytelling occurs. And I also don't think that these surveys are going to go anywhere either. So as much as we want standardization and kind of hoping that regulation would get us there, I don't know yet. It'll be interesting to see what what comes out of ISSB and how all these things play together. And I think that's still, to be seen. So who exactly is looking at this data? One of the things that I have a frequent conversation, at least once a year, with our communications folks is, we have this very extensive sustainability website, and they look at page views and visitors and all of that, and the numbers are not like they would be for the corporate site. And my point to them always is, it's not the numbers that matter, it's who is going there that matters. And when I look at this, I see many of the surveys, the third-party research organizations. I see the insurance companies that are insuring our assets. I see our trade associations. I see suppliers. I see investors. That tells me that we are that we are doing the right thing and putting the right data out there for them. So so that's just a snapshot of kind of who's actually going there and getting this data. And I think that that's a really important thing for companies to look at, particularly if you have web-based disclosures, to really understand that, because it's not the numbers of organizations or people, it's really who. That's what matters the most. And this is just a little snapshot of some of the things that we're involved in addition to the sustainability report. I write our climate reports. I worked with our investor relations and finance team on putting together a sustainable finance framework a couple of years ago. That was fun in the middle of COVID. That's when we did that. But that was so much fun from a disclosure and just something different. And we actually, when we put the framework together, we set it up so that we could go out for green bonds, social bonds, and sustainability linked bonds, as well as green other financing instruments. And we went out immediately after we had the framework in place and secured $1.45 billion to support our largest wind facilities in Oklahoma that serves customers in 3 states. That was pretty cool to be part of that. And then to be on the marketing call, because that's what you do, is you market your framework as you're going out for this capital. So that was actually pretty cool. I will say that, the climate report was a heavy lift. It is a TCFD report. That took us over a year to do that work, and that we really just scratched the surface. So I know that there's another one in my future, probably in the next couple of years. But just a little bit of, some of the things that we do. We still publish a GRI report. We publish a SASB report, which is more mapping. We also do an update to the TCFD to make sure that it's capturing current data. So we do a TCFD mapping. Then we have some industry specific that we do through the Edison Electric Institute. We do one for customers, one that's specifically for investors of our sector. So there's a lot of reporting that goes on, and that doesn't even include all the surveys, ratings, and rankings that we do, which is so important. And it's really amazing to see how and where these things show up. I've seen questions on ESG and sustainability come up in regulatory filings. I've seen it come up in new business development. I've seen it come up in RFPs. And so being able to point to all of this is really valuable for the company. And so while it is a ton of work to do, we get everything out of it. We squeeze every ounce of value out of all of this disclosure every single year. And then, we're always looking to make sure and, checking and adjusting. The work that we're doing, how is that informing the strategy of the company? How is that being operationalized? We're doing a lot more work on a just energy transition because of the transition that's underway with our generating fleet. And when we think about climate change and we think about clean energy, we typically think about it in terms of carbon emissions, and we think about it from the technical side. But our focus, we bring the people side to it. So it's the workforce, it's the communities that are affected. We did a part of our climate report. We did a just transition section of that, and it included an economic analysis of what the what the impact of a retiring coal plant is. And it's about $160 million in regional revenue, right, to the area where that plant is located. It's another 68 million in labor income, and it creates over 700 jobs in that regional economy. So really, really important that we're focused on these things. We don't want these communities to wither and die when the plants are gone. Their success is our success, and so that's why we're putting a lot of emphasis there. And then, how do we measure the impact? We see ourselves as from an impact perspective as influencers, educators, conveners, and facilitators. We do that internally, we do that externally. And really what it's all tied to the business strategy. And as we're monitoring and managing all of these risks, we are connected at the hip with our chief risk officer. Our ESG committee is a cross-functional team of sustainability, risk management, investor relations, treasury and finance, legal from a governance perspective, environmental, DEI, and communications, and procurement, sustainable procurement. Recently joined that team as well. So we are hooked at, we meet on a monthly basis and we go through, what's going on and, how do we manage and mitigate this, and what's coming up on the horizon. And from a transparency perspective, high quality data is essential. We all know that. We have our data audited internally. I think ultimately it's going to be audited externally, particularly as we move to the SEC climate rule and then human capital management. That means more and more of what's in a sustainability report is going to be audited externally. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it gives a measure of confidence, and it can help to reduce, shareholder activism, build trust and credibility. as far as our disclosure and our sustainability report, we also include a letter from the lead director of the board, basically saying that this is a fair and an accurate representation of the company's performance, and holding management accountable for that. So that's another level of assurance, if you will, coming straight from the board. And then, the integration is making sure that the things that we're doing, the environmental and social justice policy, for example, isn't just a policy that sits on a shelf, a proverbial shelf, because it's virtual, right? But that it is something that, our transmission siting and outreach team, for example, can take that policy and apply it when they are doing siting and outreach for new lines and other assets. So we're in the process of doing that, which is pretty extensive, but so that, that just kind of gives you a bit of a snapshot of the things that we're involved in, and, where we've come, where we are, where are we going? I think the core, there's no going back. There's no turning back on what we're doing today. Just in conversations with the many different investors and other stakeholders, they really want this, and they want more of it. It's not less, it's more. I do think that materiality is more important than ever. It really helps you to focus on what is relevant. We take our materiality assessment, the results that we get, and we line it up with our risk registry to see what the alignment is and where the gaps are. And that's very helpful because it validates the work that we did on the materiality assessment. I also think we're going to be doing more targeted reporting. We're already seeing that. Again, you just have to know who your audience is, how you talk about things, where you talk about things, and different audiences have different disclosure needs. So thus we have this plethora of reports and disclosure that we've been, that we do on an annual basis. And we started with one single sustainability report that was less than 50 pages. So, here we are 17 years later, and we're just moving forward. So I will pause there. That's a lot to share. It's a lot of material. I'm happy to take any questions.